So it's really fun to be back once again in Santa Cruz. I guess I've been visiting since the 60s. I grew up in Palo Alto, visited here many times with family, in part because my big sister went to UC Santa Cruz. And so the other experience I had recently was I led the economics of downtown parking study from about October 2016 to probably April of 2018, when I was working for my old consulting firm, Nelson Nygaard. And since then, my other colleagues at Nelson Nygaard have carried on with that study. But I learned a lot during that project, and some of the mapping and existing conditions work that we used on that study, or that we prepared for that study, I've included in my presentation tonight. So I want to walk you through both, though, some strategies which I think can be good potential ones for Santa Cruz, not only for downtown, but more broadly for reducing traffic and improving transportation choices throughout the community. So let me see if I can bring these. There we go, that should do it, and maybe.
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay, we can do that too. No presentation is complete without at least one technical glitch. There it is. That's the one PowerPoint on there. I guess if it's on this computer, then I should sit here?
No, you hooked in there.
Oh, okay. So this presentation goes through some of the connections between parking and transportation policies and broader issues like housing and housing affordability, like economic development, and also the connections to traffic, vehicle trips, and pollution. And some of the, there we go. Let's see, I can see it now since I can see that screen. Is it?
We don't see it. We can see it way back there.
Got it. All right. Yeah. It looks like we got a couple screens up. Shall I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So I gave this an ambitious title, Strategies for Increasing Prosperity and Housing Affordability and Social Equity while Reducing Traffic and Pollution, which is perhaps more than we can, tackle in one study session. But I thought I'd try. And I think it's worth thinking about all of these things together because they are so linked. But it's also worth considering that we have done remarkable things in the past. So that happens to be my hometown of Palo Alto in the picture. And when my mom and dad came to Palo Alto, they bought their first house. My dad was a grad student. She was an elementary school teacher. They paid about $16,000 for that house. And at the time, it cost 25 cents an hour to park on University Avenue in downtown. And now today, that same house would cost me over $2 million, and it's free to park on University Avenue in downtown. Actually, it's free to park pretty much everywhere in Palo Alto, and Americans park free on 99% of all trips. So basically, we've completely solved our affordable housing problem for our cars. And That's both striking, given the housing problems we have, but it's also worth thinking that, well, what if we started working on reversing that, or at least making it so that housing was reasonably priced and parking was priced but not necessarily free. And so I thought I'd take you through a little bit about introduction, existing conditions, including what I've seen about downtown parking inventory and occupancy, how emerging technologies are affecting demand for transportation, the transportation choices we have, and parking. And then a toolkit of strategies, some of which Santa Cruz is already doing in part, but which could perhaps be expanded. And so again, it's a toolkit to consider. And of course, parking and transportation aren't an end in themselves, but they're for your larger goals. A lot of the goals that we heard about in working on the downtown parking study, that businesses really need to be able to meet payroll, they need to be profitable this year. A lot of people perceive a parking shortage right now in downtown, especially at the peak hours. On the other hand, we've got to make progress on reducing motor vehicle use, including trips, if we really want to make progress on climate change, because it's such a big share. And of course, people in Santa Cruz really want better transportation options. And social equity matters, and especially when you start talking about changing the status quo, especially something like parking that's often been free, you have to be thinking about social equity. But the good news is there are a lot of cities out there that have done a lot. Certainly Santa Cruz is a place where I can go to other places in the United States and say, hey, here's how you could follow in Santa Cruz's footsteps, do these things for bicycling, and get to Santa Cruz's level of bicycling. But there's also a lot of strategies from around the country and around the world that I think are not in use yet, at least not in full use in Santa Cruz, and could be adopted. So this is a chart. It'll be too small to read on the screen, I'm afraid, but it's a chart of 10 cities that we studied for a project called the Pasadena Traffic Reduction Strategy Study. And we looked at what did a lot of these cities have in common, because they were all places that had managed to become really economically vibrant and prosperous, and at the same time reduce traffic. And one thing we found is that parking policy reforms, compared to status quo American policies, were really key in all of them. For example, 9 out of 10 had eliminated minimum parking requirements entirely in either some or all areas of the city. A lot of them had priced parking. Many of them, 8 out of 10, had maximum parking requirements. So I won't try to run through this whole chart, but just to say that there are lots of strategies and you don't have to pioneer, and nothing I'll show you tonight is completely pioneering. It's all been done successfully elsewhere before. Now, when we think about social equity, just take the example of housing. A basic question to ask is, well, should you subsidize housing for cars or for people? And housing, of course, everybody needs it. It's a basic human need. Parking subsidies, on the other hand, they're a matching grant program, effectively, right? You have to be able to afford to purchase and own and maintain a car. And if you can't, for example, half of the people who make less than $10,000 a year don't have a car in their household, then they can't qualify for that parking subsidy, right? Because they don't have the car to be able to use it. I always remember when I was a student first studying parking, I had a $500 rattletrap car. Stanford was kind enough to build a $50,000 parking space in today's dollars that I got to park in for free. Meanwhile, my friend Sebastian, who was on scholarships and working and had no car, he got nothing. And so it's not necessarily the best choice. And there's a lot of ways we can change that. But basically, on equity, what we see is that wealthy people benefit a lot more than poor people on average from parking subsidies. They just own a lot more cars, they drive a lot more. So on existing conditions, it's worth looking at parking existing conditions, partly to ask, can we get better use out of what we have already? So if you think of a parking system, one key aspect is the number of spaces, the quantity, and the other is management, right? Policies, regulations, prices. And you can ask, well, do we have a downtown parking supply problem right now or a management problem? Sometimes it can be both. So one thing is that it's important to collect good data. Santa Cruz does a much better job than many cities in collecting data. Things can still get better, and there are some gaps, but we were able to get a lot. Here, we prepared this with what was at the time the most recent occupancy data we had for the garages. And the main point I have in showing you this is just to say the peak parking demand in downtown Santa Cruz occurs on weekdays from 1 to 3 p.m. Early in the morning, late in the evening, it's much lower. So if you want to simultaneously reduce traffic and pollution and also reduce the need to build costly additional parking, focusing on reducing weekday parking demand from 1 to 3 p.m. or thereabouts is a really good thing to focus on, right? And similarly, if somebody is parking during that period, they drive the need for more parking potentially. But if you add one more car in the evening, that doesn't add need for more parking. So what do things look like? Well, we took the peak time parking data, which is useful in part because it covers all the parking, public, private, on street and off, and we mapped it. And this is the peak hour, December 2015. What you can see here is lots that are less than 50% full, we put in green. Lots in red are 85% or more full. And one thing you see here is this was basically busiest hour of the day, week before Christmas on a weekday. So it's one of the very busiest times of the year. It's the busiest month. You still had, on an overall basis for the whole downtown, supply exceeded demand, but there's spot shortages on some blocks, right? So like the Locust Garage, it was 91% full. The Cedar Cathcart, just to the south, Cedar Church, is it? That one as well was effectively full, like over 90%. But on the other hand, there's still ample parking. For example, the Civic Center, the Civic Auditorium parking meters, those were 76% empty. The Riverfront Garage still had spaces available and spaces to spare. What tends to happen, of course, is that the least convenient parking the least convenient and the most expensive parking tends to empty out. And so a lot of the times the challenge is to shift some employees from the high demand locations out to the lower demand locations using pricing and management. Right now, the Locust Garage, more than half of the spaces at peak hour are filled up with employees. So can you relocate them? This is the peak parking time data showing just the public off-street garages for the peak time parking survey last year. And what you see there is at that time, the Cedar Walnut Garage was full effectively, just 10% vacancy rate, which people start to think they're really hunting for the last spaces. But on the other hand, you had 110 vacant spaces at the same time in the River/Front Garage. And that Civic Auditorium lot was still empty. So what can we do to redistribute demand, especially employee demand, out to the less convenient spaces? And what does that look like on the ground? Well, first impressions, right? Curb parking on the busy blocks is mostly full, much everywhere. And then you go to the garage and it looks like that at the same time of day. Right, and so that drives a perceived parking shortage by people who don't know the system really, really well. And you can't solve that perceived shortage just by building more spaces, because you can't build more spaces on the street in front of the shops. Now, overall, the peak time parking survey, it gives you a consistent measure of demand for the whole system, including those areas for which you don't have any automated data. So those meter lots, The riverfront garage, the counter wasn't working there accurately when we looked at it. And so just mapping the peak time parking survey data for the last 15 years, or rather charting it here, what we can see is you hit a high of about 4,300 cars parked in 2008. And then the recession hit. Actually, the recession had just started before that. Retail vacancy spiked. By 2010, things were down by about a quarter. Retail vacancies were much higher then. Now we get up to 2018. There's never been a year where demand recovered back to that 2008 peak. And you're down about 10% from then.
Just a point of information, I thought we said 3,000 public spaces, so this is public and private together, the number?
It's public and private together. So this is total number of vehicles parked in the downtown. And it's covering the same area every year. And so by this data, the number of spaces that you have sitting vacant at the peak hour has increased by more than 700 since 2008. Now, it is important to note this is both the public and the private, on street and off, and it is a snapshot. So it's really good to calibrate this with other data. It's also good to use these manual counts as a reality check. What we saw, for example, when I checked, I believe it was the 2015 data, at that time, the automated count data for the riverfront garage was showing regularly over 100% occupancy, sometimes like 125% occupancy, which would imply that you have hundreds of cars inside the garage circling because every space is full. What that usually tells us is that the calibration for the garage needs to be redone. You know, that even in a well-managed system, counters are off sometimes. So it's useful to have both those data sources. But looking at this, though, you still have this perceived parking shortage. And of course, there's more development plan downtown. So it's important to still have tools to manage parking and to redistribute demand and to provide people with better choices. But so what could explain the drop in demand? And also what's a really effective tool for changing behavior? Well, all else being equal, when the price of parking goes up, demand goes down. Now that's real price changes, meaning inflation adjusted, right? If your price increases only just keep up with inflation, that has no effect on behavior. Parking price elasticities, sorry to get a little bit technical, but basically for commuting trips, about a 1% increase in demand, a 1% increase in demand will get you about a 0.4 to 0.6% decrease in parking occupancy, in parking demand. It's less for non-commuting trips. And basically, it's higher for commute trips because people are going to the same destination every day. They're often traveling at hours when there's more transit available. But we see this over and over again. So given that you've had apparently demand dropping despite 10 years of economic growth and despite things like adding the Warriors Arena, probably reaction to parking prices has something to do with this. So that's what it looks like when you chart it out. And when we were doing our projections, our forecasts of the future of parking in downtown, the model we built assumes an elasticity of 0.3, meaning a 1% parking price increase reduces demand by about 0.3%. So it's more conservative than many of the commute studies we've seen. But another thing that makes people really feel like there's a parking shortage downtown is that there's a wait list for monthly parking permits, and it's long. I forget the exact figures about how many months, but for many garages, I believe it was in the range of 9 months to wait for a permit. Well, here is the data from the waitlist survey that staff conducted in 2007. And what we found is that the vast majority of the people who are on the wait list already drive to work alone, and they park downtown every day. So, or at least every day that they work. 66% of those are already parking in some city parking facilities, and another 12 are in private lots or garages. And so what's going on? Well, basically half of those people already have a permit for a city lot, but they'd like a different lot or garage. Then the remainder, they're not waiting for a place to park, they're waiting for a better price. If you look at it, the daily rate is $8, which works out to $176 a month if you work full-time. The monthly permit's only $45. So it's effectively a 75% discount from the regular parking prices. And so if you were to let everybody on the wait list buy a permit right now, you actually wouldn't get significant new demand in downtown overall. But what you would get is a loss of a lot of revenue, because you would take a lot of people who are currently paying $8 a day, and you would be giving them that same commodity for $45 a month. So one of the options I would suggest is to look at, well, how can we change these incentives? We can see the sources of requests. Looker and Amazon account for about 20% of all the permits requested. So you have a lot of people who are often well-paid, six-figure income software programmers who are waiting for a $45 a month permit. Not sure who actually, in those cases, pays for the parking, whether it's the employee or the employer. But so just some key takeaways. I think that right now, looking at the data, you really have a parking management problem rather than a supply problem. It's a matter of the least convenient spaces are underused, the most convenient spaces are overused, and you need to shift some employees and residents out to the underused ones. And I won't reiterate those, but I do want to turn next to really thinking about how emerging technologies are starting to change parking and transportation around the United States. And let's start with ride hailing. So Lyft and Uber, they are gaining in popularity really rapidly, especially among young people. So this is the Pew Research surveys. 3 years ago, getting to 4 years ago now, 15% of adults had ever used Uber or Lyft, and now we're up to 36%. And in most people under 30, most adults that is, under 30, have used Uber and Lyft or their competitors. And especially in places where you can save money by using less parking, or save on parking hassles by using less parking, people are using it a lot. What it's actually doing in San Francisco is it's adding traffic congestion to the streets in downtown especially, but it's reducing parking demand. It's now up to 15% of all the vehicle trips that go from one point to another within San Francisco. And so what's happening to parking in San Francisco is that demand is dropping. This is the city's parking tax revenues, which is imposed both on the public parking garages and on all private parking transactions. They had expected and projected that revenues would rise substantially because we've added so many jobs and because prices were going up. And instead, it's been dropping for the last 4 years at about 1% a year or more. So instead of getting what they expected, we have double or so digit increase in revenues by now, it's dropping. And we're seeing this all around the United States. San Francisco says ride-hailing is the primary reason. It's true elsewhere. So Ace Parking, which does a lot of valet parking operations and just regular parking management operations for companies all over, they've seen declines, really substantial ones, especially in hotels, restaurants, nightclubs, places where people go out to have a few drinks and have some fun, especially because people can avoid drunk driving. So what it means is that a lot of the revenue you thought you might get may be eaten away, especially as parking prices go up. And the other thing is that self-driving shuttles and taxis are actually now a reality in certain places. And I think it was William Gibson who said, the future is already here, it just isn't widely distributed yet. And so, for example, this is the Navia self-driving shuttles in Sion, Switzerland. They've been running for about 3 years now without any incident or accident. They started out just in the pedestrian precinct. Now they run out to the nearby train station as well. Their first shuttle in the United States or their first on public streets in the United States went into service a couple years ago in Las Vegas. So this is 12 passengers. There's no brake pedal, accelerator pedal, or steering wheel. There is a stop button, and there is an operator who basically is there to reassure people, press the stop button and if needed. And actually, he also has for emergency operations, there's a joystick that he can take out from basically a hidden away box in order to drive the thing around. The thing is that self-driving shuttles are much easier because they don't have to master the whole world. All they have to do is master one route. They run that same route over and over again hundreds of times. And so that's why these have been able to go into operation. There's about 100 of these in operation worldwide. That is this particular company's. Easy Miles, another competitor, so they've been shuttling for a couple years now to and from Dallas Cowboys games and Texas Rangers games. And they've got about 200 shuttles in about 20 countries. So this is really coming. And now they're reaching the point where they're running without operators in some of their shuttles. So it's truly self-driving. And then the next step is into self-driving taxis. The technology is still expensive enough so that most people can't afford the car and the companies want to be able to maintain it. But so Waymo has started operating in Chandler, Arizona. They began commercial operation in a limited area, and then they expect to expand out. They just got permission to run on public streets with no driver at the wheel here in Silicon Valley as well. And so this technology is advancing pretty rapidly, and you can expect it to be arriving. Usually not as fast as the people making claims will say, the people hyping it, but nonetheless, it's clearly coming. And especially the self-driving shuttles are really ready to go. Like Sacramento State just got theirs, Davis just got their grant for a self-driving shuttle. And why does this matter so much? Well, with transit, about 80% of the cost is the driver. So self-driving vehicles mean that the cost of transit and taxis is going to plummet. And we don't have any comparable breakthrough on the horizon for reducing parking costs. So in the past, it might be that we could run a bus, we could afford to run the bus every 30 minutes. With self-driving technology, we can run the same bus every 6 minutes for the same price. And that's pretty transformative. The effect on parking demand, lots of people are doing studies and speculating. Basically, though, all of the estimates are for very substantial decreases in parking demand. And some are saying, well, if half of the fleet is shared, you're going to get a 90% reduction in parking demand. Others vary. Nobody knows yet, but things are clearly heading that direction, and pretty fast. So then that leads us to potential strategies. And it's useful to start out by thinking, well, all right, what does it cost to add one more space? For example, what does it cost to add one more space to downtown Santa Cruz by building a new parking structure? Because it's the cost of adding one more that really lets you look at the potential for savings. So the proposed Cedar Cathcart garage, using the low end, using the low end of the cost range for a cost estimate that was made a couple years ago, works out to $66,000 per space gained. That's conservative, I think, because not only are we using the low end, but also construction costs have gone up pretty substantially since 2016. Nationally, I think by 13%. So how much revenue do you need to generate to break even on the cost of building and operating and maintaining a $66,000 parking space. So it's about $420 a month for each space for the lifetime of the parking structure. So how much money does the city lose if it builds a new parking space just to accommodate a full-time, daytime employee who buys a monthly permit? Maybe one of those Amazon employees on the wait list. Well, $420 a month cost minus a $45 monthly permit fee is $375 a month. The only way this works with the finances of the downtown parking district is that in order to build that new garage, you have to raise a lot of rates. And what ends up happening is there's a lot of cross-subsidy going on where the people paying short-term and hourly and daily rates are subsidizing the very low-cost monthly permits. And then also, the garage doesn't pay for itself on its own. You have to take the revenues from the cars parked on the public streets and devote that toward the new garage. So what this tells us is that anything you can do to reduce parking demand for less than $375 a month, that is anything you can do to get, for example, a daytime employee to take transit or bike or walk, is a bargain, right? Then you can free up that space and use it for a customer who's going to pay a much higher hourly rate. So there are lots of strategies. I won't try to take you through all these tonight, but they fall into basically 4 categories. Managing the curb parking, managing city-owned and operated garages and lots, regulating private developments, and then generally improving choices. And the curb parking is really important both because it dictates what you can do off-street without causing problems, and also because if you can solve the on-street parking shortages in the busy areas, it gets rid of a lot of the perception of a parking shortage. And one thing, of course, that you're already working on, it's already approved, and the meters that take credit cards and have wireless connections are being put in on Pacific, maybe are already in on Pacific, Pacific Avenue, that is downtown, is installing smart meters and then being able to do what we call performance-based parking pricing. So basically, you're trying to charge the right price for curb parking, and the right price is the lowest price that lets you get 1 or 2 vacant spaces on each block most of the time. So that price can vary by block, by time of day. And the usual strategy is you pick a target range. In this graphic, it's 65 to 85% occupied as this is the sweet spot. And you check every month or so. If you're above 85% occupied on that block, then you raise the rate. If you're within the target range, you keep it the same. If you're below 65%, you lower it. And so this is a potential strategy that, of course, you're working on implementing on Pacific Avenue in the core, but that I think could be a really good one to extend to the rest of downtown. And if people like it, extend it to all the meters on the streets and everywhere in the city, everywhere you have shortages. And then, of course, returning that revenue to the district where it's generated to pay for public services is a good way to make that popular, and it's perceived as fair. And, of course, parking revenues in downtown already stay downtown. But I just want to highlight the experience that we had in San Francisco with the SF Park program, which I advised on. San Francisco did it for 6,000 curb spaces, as well as more than 10,000 spaces in garages. With this same general policy, changing by block and by time of day, the city had some great federal funding to study the effects of this very carefully, and with academic researchers doing it. Indeed, Adam Millard-Ball worked on quite a bit of it. The technology you need to do it is definitely the smart meters on the curb that are wirelessly connected, take credit cards, because that's what gets you your occupancy data and your revenue data. The occupancy is an estimate, but you can, once you get enough data where you check the real occupancy on the street compared to the meter payments, you can estimate how many cars actually parked. Because of course there are always some people parked who don't pay. So in order to do this in the rest of downtown, you would really need to roll out that kind of wireless smart meter. One of the strategies that San Francisco used is time of day pricing. And I think that could be really valuable for Santa Cruz as well. Basically, you charge a low price during the hours of low demand at a high price during the hours of high demand. So on this particular block in San Francisco, their highest price was noon to 3 p.m. when they're charging $3.50 an hour. By contrast, demand drops off after 3 p.m., so they drop the rate to $2 an hour. That's something that is really effective at reducing peak hour demand, especially getting employees out of a metered space at peak hour. And on the other hand, it doesn't chase away customers at times when you don't need to chase them away. So if somebody wants to come for lunch and stick around to shop, if demand is dropping off anyway, there's no reason to have a high price pushing them away. And one of the things is that you really don't realize often what the right price for a block is until you've experimented. This is the Marina District. I'm sorry, this is Fisherman's Wharf area in San Francisco. And what we wound up finding, to our surprise, is that the right price on one block of Bay Street was 25 cents an hour. Right around the corner, the right price was $4 an hour. And it turned out that was because the $4 an hour was the hottest restaurants in town, and the 25 cents faces a blank wall and it's on a busy street, and nobody wants to park there. So actually, employees use the 25 cents an hour parking, and but you know, you really won't know until you experiment. And a lot of what might happen is that if you had this citywide or downtown-wide, the lots at the fringes and the metered spaces at the fringes on the street would go way down in price. The results, parking search time went down by about half. People looked for spaces. There were fewer tickets and citations because it was easier to pay and easier to find a space. And sales tax revenue went way up in the pilot areas where this was implemented compared to the rest of the control areas. So you had 35% increase in sales tax revenue in the pilot areas where this was in place versus less than 20% in the controls. So it's not just about, you know, managing trips. It's also about getting better economic vitality. And then in residential areas, like this might apply especially to projects outside of downtown. It's really important to protect residents from spillover parking. So you can, in some areas, one option is you charge non-residents the right prices for curb parking if there's any excess after residents' demand is met. Use the revenue to benefit that neighborhood. You know, in Laguna Beach, near the beach, if you're a non-resident, you might be paying $3 an hour while the resident pays $40 a year. One really important thing, though, is don't issue more resident permits than there are available spaces. And this is especially important if you're adding apartments to an area that currently is only small houses. The City of Tucson, what they do is they say if you have 2 legal parking spaces in front of your property, then you can only have 2 parking permits for the street for that property, no matter how many new units you build on your property. So that's one way to do it, but don't do what Boston did. In Beacon Hill, they gave out 5,000 resident permits for an area, and then years later they went and counted and discovered they had less than 1,000 on-street parking spaces, right? So it's really important to limit it this way. So that's managing curb parking. City-operated lots and garages. Well, first I want to say the projections that I've done using the model that I built, and I've built many of these over the years for different downtowns and campuses. The forecasting the planned development as proposed by the city, including the loss of parking spaces due to various projects. And then taking into account the effect of the planned parking price increases that have already been approved by City Council last summer, what we see is that those price increases will reduce demand enough so that even with new development and the loss of some existing parking spaces within downtown, you'll still have a surplus. So this is something that you should certainly look at my calculations, review them, check them. But it's really important to remember that when the prices go up at a rate higher than inflation, demand goes down, all else being equal. That's a significant effect. And we've seen in many communities before that they raised prices to build a new garage and discovered that demand fell so much that the new garage was no longer needed. And I think that is likely to happen here. But still, it's important to keep working on all the things you could do to solve current needs and future needs. So focus on reducing demand in the peak hours. This kind of time of day pricing that SF Park did on the street, they also did off street. So the garages there, the Performing Arts Garage, their peak hour, like Santa Cruz, is noon to 3. So they charge $4 an hour. But right after that, demand drops way off, and so they drop the price down to $1 an hour. I think a strategy like that could work really well for downtown. Another thing is to consider switching from charging discounted rates for monthly permits to charging for employee parking just by the day. Administratively, it can be more difficult, but especially with the modern technology that you have in a lot of the garages and the technologies that are available to do this in lots and even on street, it can be a really good way. Because basically the problem with a monthly permit is that once you bought it, it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? You drive every day and it doesn't cost you anything more. When you switch to charging by the day, you can see results like the Gates Foundation had. They went and they switched and they started charging $12 a day, capped at $120 a month. Well, when they put that in, people could basically save money every day they didn't drive. And their drive alone rate went from 42% driving alone to 34%, right? That's like a 20–25% drop in the total number of vehicles parked. The two things that come up with that, though, is, of course, some of the people who purchase monthly permits are maybe low income, right? And then some are very high income. Some of them are programmers with six-figure incomes. So one option, right, is to get rid of the monthly permits, which would end those subsidies for the people who can't afford to pay, and then provide transportation help to low-income people, just like PG&E has lifeline rates for electricity service. A second that may be politically more feasible is that you phase out your below-cost parking rates over time, where you could just let all the existing permit holders who have those $45 a month permits renew at existing rates, but then you charge full cost prices to the new buyers. And so what that would do is it'd be kind of similar to the pension system, which has lower benefits for new hires. And with that way, through attrition, you gradually phase out the below cost rates. So that's city lots and garages. Regulating private developments. Right, minimum parking requirements are really a critical topic and one where I think Santa Cruz could make a lot of progress. At least progress toward goals like making housing more affordable. And really, these requirements, they're government regulations, right, that tell every land use developer and every owner of a property how many parking spaces they have to build at a minimum. So this is Dana Point, California. This is what 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of built space looks like. It's a lot of asphalt. The requirement for downtown for all commercial uses is here in Santa Cruz, I believe, is 2.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. So downtown is better, but even so, it's a lot of square footage for every square foot of land. It's basically 4 spaces per 1,000 works out to 1.3 square feet of asphalt for every 1 square foot of actual building space. Now, restaurants are often 10 or 20 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet required. So what's their purpose? Right? We rarely have anything required by a zoning code. Zoning codes are mostly about limiting things, right? Limiting height. So my hometown, the purpose of these parking requirements is to alleviate traffic congestion. Milpitas, similarly. Napa, similarly. San Diego, to reduce traffic congestion and improve air quality. So they had higher ambitions for theirs. Well, generally what these requirements really are good for in a practical sense is to avoid spillover problems, right? So that if the parking in front of somebody else's business fills up, they don't fill up all the parking in front of your house on the street where you live. But why did they think that minimum parking requirements were good for reducing traffic congestion? I mean, after all, we've had these things for about half a century in most of California, and clearly congestion is worse. So really, it was an economically illiterate theory. The regulations were set to ensure that virtually all spaces, all destinations had excess spaces, even when parking was given away for free. Downtown Santa Cruz, of course, is an exception, but I think the rest of the city, this is how the requirements were set. They prohibited or they discouraged parking fees. And actually, it's really hard to charge anybody for parking when everybody is required to build more than is needed when it's free, because there's nobody else who wants to buy your parking because they've got too much of their own. But then it made it really easy for traffic engineers to prohibit parking on street. Right? So like this happens to be Las Vegas. Parking's prohibited, and that way they could add more traffic lanes. So when you're on the sidewalk, you can have a 18-wheeler at your elbow as you walk down the street. And they got more traffic lanes, which they hoped would solve the congestion. But there were a lot of unintended consequences, right? Like one of the things is that in this environment, if you try to cross the street to shop, you'll die. And you got a landscape that looks kind of like this. This happens to be Milpitas. Typical minimum parking requirements. I don't think Santa Cruz's are all that different outside of downtown. Well, the unintended consequences. Cost of parking got hidden in the cost of all the other goods and services we buy. So that results in higher parking demand, more driving, more congestion, more pollution. And we all end up having to pay more because we have to build more parking and bigger roads, right? And we wound up getting higher rents, higher taxes. Basically, we're paying for parking in all of our roles except our role as a motorist. And how did this affect housing affordability? Well, Oakland, 2 economists studied what happened when they put in their first regulation in 1961. Only 1 space per unit required for apartments. So construction cost went up 18%. Units per acre went down by 30%. Land value went down by 1/3. Imagine if you were an economic development director and you came to your council and said, I got a regulation that's going to do these 3 things. It probably wouldn't have passed. But those higher costs get passed along to tenants in the form of higher rents. So Seattle, they found that the parking subsidies increased monthly rents by about $250 per month for every apartment. And parking is vastly oversupplied. And it's very, very clear from the research now, these costs get passed through and result in higher costs. Here in San Francisco, where I live now, 2 UC Berkeley professors studied it. It increased home sale prices. Homes with parking sell for a lot more than homes without. 24% more households could afford housing if they didn't include parking. And 20% more could qualify for loans on condominiums. So allowing people the choice of whether or not to buy parking when they rent or buy a place is a really good way to increase affordability. That's not to say that you shouldn't allow people to buy one, but if it's optional rather than mandated, then a lot of people can either have an apartment instead of being homeless, or they can buy their first place. And one of the things we see now is San Francisco has completely eliminated all minimum parking regulations throughout the city. And so we're seeing things like this apartment just down the street from me. That construction you see is the conversion of the bottom floor garages into 2 new apartments. And they are simultaneously seismically reinforcing the building. A lot of communities around the country now have removed minimum parking regulations, either in some neighborhoods like downtowns and near transit, or citywide. So Sacramento, San Diego, San Francisco, Fremont, Hayward, Buffalo has gotten rid of them citywide. So especially as housing costs rise, people are really focusing on this. And you do have to manage the curb parking though, right? Otherwise you'll have spillover parking problems and a lot of complaints. So to give you an example, the Gaia building in Berkeley, this is a new project. Berkeley now, by ordinance, requires the separation of the cost of parking from the cost of actually renting an apartment. So this building has a fee of $150 a month. They also require that car share spaces be provided to car share providers at no cost in any new apartment building downtown or condo. They also require free transit passes, like the discount transit pass program you just created for downtown for new residents. And so the Gaia building, 91 apartments, 42 parking spaces built. They wound up with 237 adult residents with 20 cars. And this is mostly a market rate building. It's a mix of students and downtown workers. Bellevue requires the unbundling of parking costs from office spaces, from all commercial space. So you can do it there too. And that helped them reduce their drive alone rate from 81% to 57% as they built a lot of new offices in what used to be a bedroom suburb. Another thing you can do is to require a parking cash out benefit for employees, which means that if an employer subsidizes parking for their employees, then they're required to also provide that cash to any employee who doesn't drive. So for example, if somebody wants to live downtown, walk to work, then they have to be given the cash value of their parking space. Now, one option is to do what Santa Monica does and simply enforce the existing California state parking cash out law. In Santa Monica, when you renew your business license, you have to certify you're complying with the state law. And the state law basically says if you have more than 50 employees and you pay for any part of your employees' parking, then you have to offer that subsidy, that parking subsidy, in the form of cash to anybody at your firm who doesn't drive. Another way you could do it is to require that whenever a company pays for a city parking permit, that they have to certify that they are complying with state parking cash out law. So I don't know which businesses. 41% of the people on the wait list said that their employer paid for their parking. So there may be some of those companies should be complying with this law, which is not well known about and rarely enforced. And then another thing you could do is actually go beyond state law. For example, you could say anybody who subsidizes parking for their employees and buys a city parking permit has to offer the cash value to the ones who don't drive. And it has a really strong impact. So for example, if the employees are offered $165 a month in cash, there's about a 30% decrease in parking demand and driving. That's from an academic study by Professor Donald Shoup at UCLA. We put that into effect with Genentech in South San Francisco. They're out in the office park east of 101. And over 6 years, combined with some other measures, we got their drive alone rate down from 77% to 55%. So there's strategies for regulating private developments. And that's close to the end. Of course, you're already working on providing the deep discount transit pass for all downtown employees, which I think is a really powerful way to do it. Actually providing the free transit passes to every employee in a group, that kind of universal access has proven in several studies to be the most cost-effective way to go. So I think you made a good decision there. And then review and expand your local transit networks as you can either contribute funding or add your own shuttles. Consider a self-driving shuttle pilot program, right? Like here's one that Ann Arbor has just started up. Of course, you can keep improving your bicycle programs. You've obviously done a lot. And especially these kind of protected bike lanes have a much greater effect than the older unprotected bike lanes that are seen around town. And I know you're working on that. And of course, in the short term, it may just be paint. But in the long term, you can build really beautiful streets like this one in the Netherlands, where you're really comfortably separated and you're closer to sidewalk level. So just to sum it up, I think the challenges that we have is to manage parking and transportation for the next few years. And then as self-driving shuttles and taxis really take off, that effect on parking demand will be profound. And so the challenge is to manage the next few years and get through that. And then with time, a lot of the garages will empty out. One thing, of course, is that parking lots and garages always tend to empty out from the least convenient spaces to the most. So it's important to keep an eye on what's going on with your least convenient spaces and make sure that you're making good use of those. So pricing, like the curb parking pricing I talked about, is an important way to get to that. So there's a long list of strategies. I'll, of course, leave these slides with you. And with that, thank you for your time.